So that's what we had an interesting.
Ja, sehr verehrte Damen und Herren, Ladies and Gentlemen, ich begrüße alle ganz herzlich.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome all of you to the next session, the third today, after two interesting sessions on whether civil society can promote peace processes and the role of religion in globalization. We are now moving on to talk about the rights of children. Do we require public service, or will the market do? The whole series of the Open Forum is organized by Bread for All, the Swiss Federation of Protestant Churches, together with the World Economic Forum. And this particular forum, a session, has been co-organized by the International Federation of Terre des Hommes. And in particular, I would like to thank Peter Bray, the Secretary General, who is among us, for co-organizing this forum, this session. And I would like to pass the floor over to your facilitator, moderator, Sally Bondock. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, and thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many of you on this early evening on a Saturday, and we look forward to your participation, because the whole point of the Open Forum is to hear your views on these important subjects that we're going to discuss. And of course tonight we're looking at children's rights, public service or market rules, the basic human rights of education and health. Many children around the world, unfortunately, do not have these rights. So we're going to discuss why, ways of improving that scenario, what the obstacles are. And we've got a fantastic set of panelists who are with us this evening to discuss this subject. But also I would like you to feel a real part of this. And we're going to get you involved a lot sooner than you think. So don't get too relaxed in your seats, because I'm looking for your involvement, I'm looking for your questions and your comments. So without further ado, let's get started. I just want to say as well, we've got an hour and a half, which to me, what I do for a living, I present a programme for the BBC. You may watch BBC World, I hope you do. If you do, around about 5 o'clock in the morning, you'll see me on the air, that's London time. And when I get to talk about a subject, whether it be the US economy or, I don't know, the situation in Israel or whatever, I normally get 2 minutes with my guest. 2 minutes. Well, we have an hour and a half, which is sheer luxury. So normally I'm very frustrated we don't get to the real heart of the issues. Well, tonight I hope we do. So let me tell you who we've got here on the panel. Many of them don't need any introduction at all, but I'm going to give you one nevertheless. If we start with, on my far left, we've got Mary Robinson there. She has got many, many titles. She's Executive Director of the Ethical Globalization Initiative. Now, this has many roles, but just to give you a snapshot, what this initiative does is it seeks to work with those who are committed to bringing the values of human rights to the tables of where decisions about the global economy are being made. You could argue that's happening this week here in Davos. So Mary is representing that initiative. Also, she was, of course, served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and President of Ireland, among other things. Mary's been a very busy lady, and tonight she's managed to give us some of her time, which is fantastic. Next to Mary, we've got Michael Spence, who's a Professor Emeritus of Management in the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. He's also a partner at Oak Hill Capital Partners, Oak Hill Venture Partners. He's got a long, long list of academic achievements. It would fill an hour and a half easily. It does include the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences. Next to Michael, we've got Ezra Mbogori. I hope I've got that right, Ezra. Ezra's joining us from Zimbabwe. He's the Executive Director of MWENGO, which is based in Zimbabwe. This is an organization, its mission is to nurture a community of values by strengthening and mobilizing African human resources in support of organizations fighting for justice. But also just to mention about Ezra, he's founder of the Kenyan NGO Council, which serves on the Commonwealth Civil Society Advisory Committee. Ezra also does many other things. Again, I've just selected a few. Next to Ezra, we've got Enrique Iglesias, who's president. Sorry? Yeah, not the singer. I'm glad he pointed that out. I wasn't going to bring that up, Enrique, but as you have, I'm glad you have. I must admit, I did a bit of a search on all these guests on the internet, and Enrique, there were pages and pages, photographs, album covers, the lot, but this is not the Enrique the singer. This is the president of Inter-American Development Bank, which is based in Washington. Now, this bank's main focus is the financing for economic and social and institutional development in Latin America and the Caribbean. And he was, as well, once upon a time, Uruguay's Minister of Foreign Relations, I must get that right, also Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So as you can see, we are gradually circling the globe with our panellists. And last but by no means least, we have Ignacio Paca, who is the Program Director of Terre de Hommes Foundation, which is based here in Switzerland. As you heard, it's one of the main organisers of this particular discussion. This is the largest Swiss NGO, which is a non-governmental organisation working for children internationally. It currently is active in 30 countries around the world. Ignacio and his colleagues are involved in direct aid programmes and advocacy programmes in the field of children's rights. But apart from that, he's also a public health economist, and as ever, many other things to mention, but I won't go into all the detail because we want to hear what they have to say. So without further ado, let's get this discussion cracking and start with a question about children's human rights. It's one of the ones that's on the sort of the little leaflets you've got, which I can see you're all holding. Let me encourage you to think of your questions and your comments as soon as possible, because I'm going to be throwing it to you sooner than you may think. But if we start with Mary, who's getting a slurp of water there. Mary, let's start with the first question on the list, just to get us off the ground. Is the degradation of public services an inevitable product of a globalized world? Globalization, a big subject all week at the World Economic Forum. Make sense of that for us, and we're talking in layman's terms tonight.
I think it is a process that we're seeing, that more and more services are being privatized. And of course, this affects children, services in education, services in health, and so on. And it is a very important issue from a human rights perspective, because classically, as you know, the primary responsibility for human rights, as reflected in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which every country in the world has ratified, except for the United States and Somalia, the responsibility is with governments. But because of deregulation of so many services in relation to children, some of it required, or because of pressure from the IMF in saying you must cut down on your bureaucracy, and sometimes weakening health services, weakening education services as an unfortunate consequence of that, we realised that it wasn't sufficient to just have that primary responsibility with governments, which there still is. And there are very good guidelines, which I'm sure some of you in the audience are aware of, from the Committee on the Rights of the Child. I know you don't want this to be technical, but maybe as a framework, if you just allow me to refer to some of the points which the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which is based in Geneva, which has the special responsibility for the Convention, made. And this was at a special meeting in January of 2002, where they had a discussion on the responsibility of the private sector as service provider and its role in implementing child rights. And it's quite a detailed statement, so there's no excuse for private providers not to know what their responsibilities are. But let me just pick out the main things. First of all, the committee made it clear and emphasised that paragraph 3 of the Convention, which provides that in all actions concerning children, whether undertaken by public or private social welfare institutions, courts of law, administrative authorities or legislative bodies, the best interests of the child shall be primary. And then it goes on to point out that the general principle of non-discrimination must be upheld. And then coming to the role of states, it says the committee recommends that state parties, when privatising or contracting out services to non-state actors, enter into detailed agreement with agreements with the service providers, ensure independent monitoring of implementation as well as transparency of the entire process. So there's a state accountability. The committee also reminds state parties of its recommendations that were taken up at the 10th anniversary that, and I quote, in any decentralisation or privatisation process, the government retains clear responsibility and capacity for ensuring respect for the obligations under the Convention. And this is really very important. Even if the service is privatised, the government retains an ultimate and primary responsibility. And then it goes on, and these are very important recommendations to non-state service providers. The committee calls on all non-state service providers to respect the principles and provisions of the Convention. It further recommends that all non-state service providers take into account the provisions of the Convention when conceptualising, implementing and evaluating their programmes, including when subcontracting other non-state service providers. And it calls upon the service providers to ensure that they carry out in accordance with international standards, and then says, this is what you can do. You must develop self-regulation mechanisms. And it says you must adopt a code of ethics or a similar document which should reflect the Convention. Then, secondly, develop indicators and benchmarks as a prerequisite for measuring progress and establishing accountability. Next thing is the inclusion of a system enabling various partners to challenge each other regarding their respective performance in implementing the code and establishing a complaints mechanism. Maybe I just stop there and just take a reflective moment to see that the human rights community realises that now it's important, when so many services have been privatised, to ensure that the standards carry through. But to me, the shocking reality, which we have to remember, is that more than 6 million children die each year from hunger. Many more die from preventable diseases. More than 120 million children are not in education. So even though the committee has tracked the responsibilities, they're not being implemented. And I think this is something this panel can really look at.
All right, so the structure is there, or the law is there, as it were, and the responsibility is laid out, but the question is what's happening practically, and why are, as you say, so many children dying and the situation not seemingly improving. Ezra, let me ask you, because on a practical note, obviously Mary's outlined what's in the various legal documents, but what's actually happening on a practical basis in the developing worlds where, you know, privatisation is occurring?
Yeah, I think the reality is that governments are under tremendous pressure, at least in the region that I work in. And one example for me that always serves as a very useful illustration of the sort of pressures that they're under is an experience that I had when UNICEF conducted a what I thought was a very successful campaign, where they put out some very simple messages to governments saying, you know, trying to get governments to adopt the notion of a first call for children, that if they have to make any decisions, especially around the allocation of resources, that children should be the last category of allottees to be struck off the resource allocations. And I remember it inspiring a lot of policymakers at the time that it was presented. And people signed on, indeed, like most governments sign on to all these conventions. But then when it came to making the actual decisions, there weren't advocates there that ensured that governments stuck to that obligation. And I think that inevitably you end up arguing with those who are pushing you to make decisions, with, you know, your IMF monitors and all the others who say you do have to implement cutbacks in these areas. And so what seemed to have been a really logical line of action to take is simply abandoned. And instead, they make decisions which they think are in the interests of the country, but which actually end up impacting most harshly on the children. So in reality, I mean, there's a real gap between rhetoric and reality. All governments that I know of have very happily embraced these principles. But when it comes to implementation, you see next to nothing.
Would you say, Ignacio, that's the experience you've had? Obviously, you work in something like 30 countries. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, certainly. I would share all what Ezra has just said. And it's no good waiting either for implementation. And I came back during the night from a meeting in Kathmandu, we're in the process with different projects in Egypt, Palestine, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, of sharing what we are doing. What we are doing means national staff in the countries, and it is to act, and to act locally to start with. There is a silent revolution going on of people that are being progressively empowered, and I'm not using the word empowered as the rhetoric that we often hear of. Empowering is not an easy work to do, and it takes years and years to listen. Listen is the first thing. Listen to the people in their difficulties and so on, to create trust and to enable them, for them to act. We're not talking only about victims. There is, of course, the position of pure indignation, can come out with statistics and so on. But of the everyday life, people have potentials, and even in a difficult environment, they can get together, and progressively, it takes a long time. This is the work to be done locally, but at the same time, work has to be done at another level. Well, Nepal, for instance, for the last 10 years, we've been acting locally, but we are also working to change rules and regulations in Nepal. So we act locally, but we also work with coalitions at governmental level. And this is the silent revolution that I think will push forward, and it's based a lot on elements of values. Listen to the people, respect the people, and trust in their capacities.
Enrique, give us your view on what's been said so far. Would you agree?
Look, I think if I can refer to the experience in our region, in particular in the experience on privatization, which is something which is in the center of your question, for the upper and middle classes, you may try. There can be experiences in which really privatization with very good regulatory system can provide results. And in a way, sometimes it saves money to the government by having more direct link to those upper classes who can pay for their services. When you go to the lower classes, then it's very difficult to see a system in the private hands. There has been some experiences, but are very difficult and must be very strongly controlled by the state. I think there the public sector has a tremendous, unavoidable, unescapable responsibility. And I think in that sense, what we are trying to do, for instance, I'm talking for a developing bank, is precisely to concentrate our support to this sort of intervention, which is a big amount of people. We are talking that the has 42% of the region under the poverty line. So in that sense, in that area where really you must concentrate the efforts, and 50% of our activities are in the private, in the social sector. And there you can see the need. It's very difficult to rely on privatized intervention. I think the public sector is responsible for that. What we need is to give them the money to perform, and particularly to give resources to improve the efficiency. You see, one of the things that worry me in the third world, and it's because we are the third world, is the lack of efficiency in the way we use the resources. The most important resources that we have now is to use well what we are getting either through taxes or through borrowing money. And that area is where the big success must take place. So I think in general, I would say privatization, yeah, in certain cases can work, but when you go below, you go to the poorest area in the society, really the state has to be present. There is no way to escape from that responsibility.
Just to say that efficiency problems in sort of health scenarios are also very evident in the first world as well. I can say certainly for the UK that's the situation. But Michael, I just want to ask you on this subject: is there something to be said for in developing countries for a proper infrastructure to be put in place, a proper healthcare service to be there, or an education system to be there before you can start thinking about privatizing it or bringing in outside organizations or private contractors? Don't you have to have the basics before you start that off?
Well, let me back up a minute. I basically agree with less detailed knowledge with what I've just heard, and remind everybody that even in the advanced countries, elementary and secondary education, with no exceptions, is a public sector investment. And as far as I can tell, privatizing this is going exactly in the wrong direction. The truth is that my children's education has a substantial benefit to the citizens, the other citizens in the country. It's what economists call public good. And so it isn't surprising that if you relied entirely on private investment, that's what it is, an investment, then you'd get under expenditure on it. And it's just sort of simple principle in economics, and that is why we don't leave it to private decisions to invest in children in this dimension. Much the same is true of healthcare, although it's a mixed provision. So with those kind of principles in the background, it's almost impossible to understand that a path on which the people in the world who have the least capacity to pay are being asked to subject themselves to a private sector that's supposed to be providing at an optimal level of public good. Now, I forgive the jargon, but I mean, I think the principle is kind of clear. And so I would say that while globalization has had many beneficiaries over a long period of time, it's a process, there are very ugly episodes that are very destructive, and they're destructive to individuals' incomes and wealth and also to governments. And I'm in complete agreement with the people who say that the global economy during those destructive periods, like the one that occurred in the late 90s, that it has a bad effect, that it was inappropriately responded to by sort of global financial institutions and semi-regulators by trying to get the fiscal and monetary houses in order and forgetting the social, political and other costs associated with doing that. And I think the hopeful sign is there's a recognition that forgetting the social, political and other costs is a bad idea, even among those institutions. One final comment. The problem in the global economy, and it is what many critics of the global economy say, it's probably their deepest point, is that unlike all of our domestic economies, which are overseen by governments and regulators, the global economy is not overseen by any set of institutions that have the authority that our domestic ones do. And furthermore, it's in the global economy, particularly in the financial markets, is in many ways informationally immature. That means the knowledgeability of the participants is less than in local markets, and that results directly in volatility on occasion, and volatility is what causes much of this destructiveness. And it's precisely in those episodes that one is in greater need of authoritative, legitimate regulatory bodies that can step in and stop the market forces from producing those results. So I think globalization has resulted in destructive episodes, and that the cutting of government budgets, particularly in this area as a response, is extremely unfortunate.
So perhaps as globalization increases, accountability decreases. I know, Mary, you want to respond to that.
Yes, I wanted to come in on that issue of accountability, again, as the Committee on the Rights of the Child see it, even of international institutions. And it's kind of interesting, they say, and I just quote again, that policies and programmes for service provision undertaken as part of economic or fiscal reform initiated at the national level or by international financial institutions should not in any way compromise the possibility of public or non-state service provision. And then they go on, the Committee further encourages state parties and the IMF, the World Bank, and regional financial institutions or banks to take carefully into account the rights of children as enshrined in the Convention and other relevant international instruments when negotiating loans or programmes. And I just wondered on that kind of issue of accountability, Enrique, how would your sort of bank assess the implications in a loan context in a state in your region? Because I agree with you very much. Privatised education, maybe an elite middle class, maybe, but lower down, it by and large is disastrous. I mean, it's terrible. And can you, in the bank, exercise some kind of accountability and scrutiny?
Well, we do not have any fixed solution for the 8 countries. I mean, this is sovereign decision by the countries. For us, privatization is not a religion or something like that. In the area of education, clearly in Latin America, the big bulk of education is done by the public sector, and there is no other way. What we are trying to do now, in order to make more effective use of the public resources, is to use another mechanism which is giving us, and is giving the countries a very important success, which is to pay the mother some money if the children go to the school and go to the medical doctor once per month, or go to the dentist every 3 months. And this is very impressive. There is a wonderful programs in Mexico called Oportunidades. There are 20 million people already under this system, which is almost 20% of the population. And also in Brazil, with Bolsa Escola, in which really you try to give, you pay the family a certain subsidy if the children go to school. And then you compete with the street. You compete with it. This is doing very well. And I think this is a very good way to use resources in which really you can invest. And this is type of things we are trying very much in this.
So there's creative ways, isn't there, of getting around the problems. And I know, Michael, that's something you've found has been successful as well, hasn't it? Compensating families, poor families, in return for their children going to school. Because in many countries, children are working because frankly, the family need the money. And therefore, you have to sort of get around that problem. Now, I know a lot of you have still got a lot to say, but I just want to throw this open to the floor to see if we've got comments, questions, anybody there with some thoughts, experiences. We have a gentleman there at the back, even. I'm going to just pop these on for those that don't speak German. This is your moment.
I'll ask the question in English. This is, given the seriousness of the discussion, this has been a rather polite panel. We heard that privatization is not a religion. I work together with Ignacio at Terre. We have the impression in all those countries that it's perhaps not a religion, but it's automatic. And the second thing is that we now hear, you know, the problem is being recognized. But as an NGO, we've been saying it for 10 years. And, you know, when we started 10 years, everybody said, this is a bit of nonsense. So my question would be to Mary Robinson, you know, people are hearing. The question many NGOs ask here in Davos is, are they really listening? What do you think?
I take your point completely, because what we're now seeing is a sort of admission, particularly at the IMF level, that the policy of a kind of philosophy that the public sector was bloated, bureaucratic, and did things badly, and if you could privatize, somehow everything would run smoothly, that simply does not and has not worked. It has actually led to already slightly weak or not very efficient education or health systems being gravely weakened. And now, especially with the pandemic of HIV and AIDS, we're seeing an attempt to recognize that the first thing we must try and do is build up health systems again, and build up education systems. So, unfortunately, because of the policy that was adopted, we've weakened the position. And all I can say is at least there now seems to be a recognition that it is absolutely vital. I mean, it's seen perhaps more now in the context of the pandemic of HIV and AIDS, the number of AIDS orphans, the impact on children, the impact generally on the mothers and fathers, teachers, nurses, doctors, the ones that are being particularly affected by the pandemic. But you know, I think you're right to say, yes, you know, we should be angrier, if you like. I think we're trying to see, you know, what the problem is really. The IMF is marking now its 60th anniversary. I have a sense that there is more internal questioning of that whole policy of restructuring approaches as being a sort of orthodoxy, economic orthodoxy. And I think it is NGOs like yours that have, you know, paved the way for this rethinking by pointing out that it just simply has not worked, and that we must strengthen health and education systems. It can be some kinds of combinations, maybe, of public and private, but it must be an effective working health system with access to the poorest, the most vulnerable minorities, children in particular.
Any more questions or thoughts from the floor? We're all very quiet. They've got one there right at the back. Go ahead.
Hi. Just one point about one of the main bases of the global capitalism. is it not? Are we not going to have a better future for children only when we start to value their resources and the country's resources better on the capital level? Because at the moment, is that not one of the main problems? We continue to devalue the resources. We don't rate them as they should be rated within the capital society.
Ezra, would you like to respond to that? A lack of valuation of what's there?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me I guess, in a sense, correct an impression that I think Enrique made when he was talking about the need to invest in these areas. And he then gave the impression that one of the biggest problems in the third world is the absence or the need to increase efficiency in our application of available resources. And I think that is, while that is a necessary area to work on, there is a limit beyond which you really cannot be any more efficient. If a country, for instance, is obliged to pay up to 40% of its total revenue in debt repayments, and that way forego the opportunity to invest in areas like health and other social services, then I don't care how efficient it is, it just does not have those resources, period. And that, for me, in correcting that impression, is also, in a sense, responding to that question. It is the pressures that the government is under to honor obligations that it has made in the past that make it impossible for it to actually show that it values the resources, in people. I mean, every political leader that I know of talks about, the citizens of the country being the greatest resource. Companies talk about their staff as the greatest resource that they have. But they do not then turn around and actually invest in ensuring that they maximize the potential of those resources. And I think that's where the real problem is. It is that the resources, one has to invest, and there are certain absolute basics that have to be respected. And that just is not happening, and it is the global system that makes it impossible.
If we get your... Oh, go on then, Enrique, I'll let you jump in, but we want to get Ignacio's response to that as well. Go on.
Just to complement, I think I agree basically what he said. What I'm referring to efficiency, I'm thinking with the existing amount already invested. In a way, if the debt burden limits more investment in social areas, correct, and I think you are right on that. But I will tell you one example we have been developing in Central America. The school or the hospital get that amount of money. This is the only thing that the public sector under this constraint can give. But the administration of this is put into the hands of the fathers and the teachers, so they make their own management. Not the curriculum, and this comes from the Minister of Education. And this was tremendously productive. It's the same amount of money. So what I mean, this is the type of efficiency I mean into this. Sometimes the participation in the administration of the schools, of the hospitals, improve enormously with the same amount of money simply because the people participate in their administration and management. Okay. That is what I'm saying.
Just to ask you, Ignacio, because on the subject that the gentleman raised about valuing the resources that are there, if we look at the big picture, it is seemingly very gloomy and there's a lot of big issues to sort out. But in many countries, there's some very good local projects going on, run by local people, aren't there, that are solving problems and getting around some of the difficulties that are there in certain countries.
Yeah, certainly we mustn't underestimate the resources of individuals when you give them the right setting for them to be able to express their capacities. But what I wanted to come in here is say, isn't it a beautiful world? It's a wonderful world. Everybody agrees. We're all agreeing. It's linked to resources. It's linked to efficiency and so on. But since we started the panel, there are 1,000 kids who have died. Others who have decided that they're going to migrate illegally to countries with, that have better resources. I mean, we're talking about accountability. Perhaps we have to look back 10 years ago when some big professionals, well paid in Washington and other places, devised a strategy based on privatization when the economic textbooks clearly state, I mean, there are market failures and so on. It can never work for public goods. But we entered into that. We entered into that. And now, of course, everybody started. This afternoon, in one of the sessions here, a representative from the World Bank said, yes, we did make mistakes, but now we're on a better track. Let's talk about accountability and errors of people that have been made 10 years ago and so on. The clock is ticking. The clock is ticking. And every time we say, yes, we have made mistakes, but we have better plans, and we all agree, and let's go on. Yes, okay, let's go on. And what the NGO community is doing is just tiny. It's tiny. It needs more coherent effort by different players, by NGOs and by other global players. Let's hope also that the World Bank now, with new ideas, new people there, are going to be able to play a stronger role, because they are probably one of the main players that can help to get out of the situation, and to get out of the situation, the dead end in which we are now, and to get out fast, quickly.
Mary, if I can get you to respond to that, because round of applause there. Obviously, that's representing the sentiment here. But Mary, if I can get you to respond to that, because your initiative is about, isn't it, bringing together all these different voices and trying to come to a conclusion which will actually solve the problems and find answers rather than just rhetoric.
Yes, and in fact, we are organizing together with New York University, we're co-organizing a conference with the World Bank at the highest level, including Jim Wolfenson and very senior members, looking at a human rights, human development approach. And one of the sessions is actually on child rights, children's education and child labour. And it's a conference that hopefully will lead to a more major conference, which will really flesh this out, because, again, I also want to emphasize accountability. If I can almost link it to when I read the second question, I really wasn't happy with it. I know I sound very like a lawyer, but there's a reason for it. You know, can privatization provide solutions that meet basic needs and do not exclude major sections of society? To me, we're not talking about basic needs, because that means kind of compassion and we look after your needs. We're talking about basic rights that pertain to every person, that are under the Convention of the Rights of the Child, that have been ratified, as I said, by every country, except 2, unfortunately. And why I say that is, we then have accountability. So what are the tools of accountability that can help NGOs to put more pressure? Because that's the only way, as you say, NGOs can do a certain amount. There are the tools of the reports of countries under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'm very glad that those working on child rights and against poverty are using those more and more. Yes, it's only naming and shaming, but governments do not like to be shamed in public. Secondly, we have the Millennium Goals. Interestingly, the World Economic Forum itself, Davos here, has done the assessment, and I'm on the steering committee, showing a very poor report card on education, a very poor report card on health. If everybody from here went out and used that with their governments who must bring in country reports, why don't we make more accountability? And yes, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, all of them have to have more accountability, not for needs, but for basic rights. And then from the other end, I very much agree that we must empower in the real sense of a structured awareness that these are a matter of right, a matter of discussion, how to implement, a matter of participation in the decision-making, and that this has to infect and affect decision-making at every level, because we cannot go on in the way that things are. Maybe I'll make it just personal. I've just become a grandmother, and I see life through the eyes, I really see life through the eyes of a little boy born on the 12th of December, who is fortunate to be born in Ireland, to have stable parents who, you know, and I know so many situations where just where a child is born matters so desperately, and that's not right. It's not moral, it's not ethical, and it's not acceptable. And it is so widespread, the reality of life chances of children. And that is, as I say, an essential matter where we have seen the legal commitments, not just rhetoric, but legal commitments. The challenge for civil society as it mobilizes worldwide, as I saw it in Mumbai, mobilizing as a world social movement, the challenge is to hold to accountability and to insist on better tools of accountability.
The question is, though, does globalization increase accountability, something we touched on earlier? Because when you've got multinational companies operating all over the world, operating in developing countries, this does affect people's lives, it affects children's rights, and yet these people cannot influence those decisions in any way. If it's a government, they can maybe get their voice heard through the means of voting, but with if I bring in the sort of influence of business here, that makes things ever more complicated. And as Ignacio was saying, often it's about listening, but those that need to be listened to are not being heard. Michael, can I get your view on the sheer complication that globalization brings when it comes to these issues we're discussing?
I'll give it a try. President Clinton gave a speech at the start of the World Economic Forum, which I think is fundamentally right. So I want to put this part of it in. I don't think these problems are going to be easily dealt with, although the progress can be made, until a very large coalition of the advanced industrial countries and the developing countries comes together and starts to engage in what he called systematic planning and action. And by that he meant there's too much, well, he said directly to us, there's too much talk and not enough action. And even the action is sort of structurally fragmented. And I think that's a lot of what's producing the frustration that, that many of us feel. On the question of multinationals and globalization, I really feel that countries need to make an assessment of whether the presence of multinationals in their country is beneficial or not, and in what sectors and areas, because countries control that. And I think that the days are over when people say, fine, let the market system work, and we won't regulate it very much, because that doesn't work. I mean, that is a problem. And you get volatility, you get hot money moving in and out, you know, so fast that you can hardly see it. And the successful development stories like China, like South Korea, are stories in which there was a significant amount of regulation and gradualism and experimentation in what worked for the people. And so I think that's an important part of this too, Sally.
All right, I just want to go on, Mary. One quick comment before we get the views of the floor.
I don't want to come in too often, but just on the responsibility of multinationals, there was a very useful piece of work done by the Subcommission on Human Rights last August in adopting the norms and responsibilities of transnational corporations and other business. There's an extremely good report by Amnesty, which is available, circulating here in Davos, or I'm sure it's on their website, which explains the importance of those norms. We're working in our project with 7 corporations, and they're quite big corporations. Novartis here in Switzerland, ABB, Barclays Bank, MTV, Body Shop, and they are sort of internalizing these norms and responsibilities. And all they are is existing international law, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, saying clearly primary responsibility of states, but also responsibility of transnational corporations. So we're getting into the accountability, but nobody will be accountable unless they're held to accountability by public opinion, by NGOs, by people knowing this. That's the important thing, and insisting that there is accountability.
All right. Any more questions? Yes, gentleman here, if we can get a microphone to him.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to come back to child labor, because I think it's a critical issue for children, because that's basically what prevents them to be healthy and prevents them to go to school and play. And I think in this area, there might not be a strong consensus on speeches. I'm very fascinated by what President Iglesias described earlier, because it's really trying to tackle the evil at its roots, in a way. But I remember I talked with a UNICEF, whatever, chairman, who told us that UNICEF is against the worst shapes of children's exploitation. And I said, why don't you claim that all child labor should be banned on the planet? And he said, you know, culture, we got to be pragmatic and stuff. I think we can be pragmatic, just like the Inter-American Development Bank did. We can be pragmatic, but we probably should be clearer on the fact that children should go to school and never work. So maybe we could also act, and maybe the IMF or the World Bank could act in that direction, helping the informal sector, or the people economy as we prefer to call it, helping the people in the informal sector to not need any longer this cheap workforce. But that is probably through both incentives and maybe also through constraints. I'd like to have the panel's point of view on this.
All right, let's get some points of view. If I start with you, Ignacio.
Yes, let's go through education, and there we are. I mean, it seems a bit simple, but I can go to a recent example that we have with in Afghanistan. Been working in Afghanistan for at least 10 or 15 years, and in a remote area, Rustak, that's where there was the earthquake in 1999. This is not Taliban area at the time, but not very much better. And there's the question of the girls that work at home, do not have access to school. So what should be done? Well, let's start by creating the facilities for education. Creating the facilities for education is not building a building and putting teachers in it. It is also going to the parents and working with the parents, with the community, for them to understand why should girls, for instance, go to school, and that it is again education being a public good, but for them to understand the reasons why, and then they're going to trade off. Okay, my daughter goes to school, but she works less. Perhaps she only works a few hours a day instead of working all day. But they're going to do the trade-off. Eh? It is with the people that we have to be working. And this example of Rustak is that a building and putting teachers in a school is not sufficient. It is working with the people to create the link between the community and the services that they should be using, or that they have to be convinced that they should be using. And if we're talking about child labor, one of the answers, I don't want to be too long, but one of the answers is creating the facilities for education.
Michael, could you elaborate on the creative way of getting around this issue when it comes to child labour, i.e. perhaps subsidising a family so that their children can go to school?
Yeah, you know, I agree with the earlier comments that this is one of the most effective, and it's turning out to be really quite sound in Latin America, ways of subsidizing poor people and at the same time achieving the objective of avoiding this dilemma among those who are in poverty of having an insufficient family income or an uneducated child. And so, but I'd like to make a broader comment. I don't think this problem is going to be solvable unless the advanced countries, which have somewhere between 750 million and 1 billion people out of the total population of the planet, invest directly in this. I mean, there's a trap that you can't get out of at this level, and I think the only way to get out of it is for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in these countries to take this seriously and essentially appropriate a fraction of our income that gets directed to these investments in young people in developing countries.
Ezra, would you say, in a sense, the developed world has a huge responsibility and must be much more involved in coming up with the cash?
I would certainly say that. I mean, I agree entirely with what Michael said about trying to build up a coalition of the powerful. That's, you know, the developed countries, and getting them to support efforts. Because as far as I'm concerned, no sort of self-respecting parent would really want to subject their child to the vagaries of child labor, you know? But if the survival of that household depends entirely, not, you know, sometimes it's a household, sometimes it's a child themselves. If it entirely depends on that child going and toiling away, then you really are left, you know, your back is to the wall. You have no choices. I can name, you know, I can reel off millions of stories of children who have gone through a transformation after having sort of been involved in child labor for some time and then having had the opportunity to get an education, you know. But I think there are many other examples. One country that recently decided that they would adopt a universal primary education system and that they would make it mandatory for every child at the age of 5 to be in school, found themselves having a really hard time just marshalling the resources to keep everybody in school. For me, one really important indicator was that enrollment levels went, and this is something that happened just last year, enrollment levels went up by more than 50%. You know, it just showed the number of children that were not in school because they couldn't afford it. Once it was made, you know, a service that was available, even though the education experts immediately started decrying the decrease in the standards of education, the overall consensus was it was necessary to take that first step. Now that country is scrambling, looking for the resources to keep that practice in operation. You know, so there is, I think, a huge responsibility from developed countries. I mean, yeah, from developed countries to pitch in and make this happen.
And again, there has been, you know, a big commitment in this. I come back to the accountability because we had the Millennium Declaration in September 2000. We had the Millennium Development Goals. One of those goals is that every child, girl and boy, should have access to full primary education by 2015, in 12 years' time. That was costed at a conference for financing for development in Monterrey. And the estimate that Ernesto Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, and his colleagues made was that to fulfill the Millennium Development Goals and the timelines, having absolute poverty, those living in absolute poverty by 2015 and so on, that it would cost an additional $50 billion a year, which meant effectively doubling the global development assistance at that time. And what I find shocking is, A, we've come nowhere near that. We may have another 12 billion, you know, through US, EU, all the money that has been promised. So that's part of the failure. That was part of the stock taking done here in the World Economic Forum assessment. But there doesn't seem to be, you know, a real advocacy about this. It won't be possible. And there is that goal 8, which is the partnership goal that the UN Development Report is about this year. It's about the fact that countries with their debt problems, with the problems of one commodity and that commodity not having proper pricing. And something that I'm very conscious of as president of Oxfam, because I've done a lot of work on this, is the global assistance is now about $57 billion a year, as I understand it. And what the agricultural subsidies and restrictions on imports from the developing countries like cotton from West Africa and other, that takes out of the economies of poor countries over 130 billion US dollars. So, you know, there's more prohibition on trading out of poverty. So all of this is connected. And what we need is to remind ourselves that there was a huge commitment with timelines. And that helps to accountability. It's a kind of political accountability. And I'm actually disappointed that the World Economic Forum, having commissioned this you know, assessment, having put it into the package of every person who's attending with their badges the forum, that there hasn't been more discussion about how far we are from delivery. You know, this is where we need to become really angry, as was said, yes. And, you know, and get mobilized about it.
I mean, Enrique, I know you're wanting to respond to that, but I just wanted to give you to give an example of that. I mean, you were just saying that the discussions are not necessarily happening here. I mean, if we talk about some of the 2 key speakers of this week, we had US Vice President Dick Cheney today saying he wants increased world cooperation and effective international institutions to help wage war on terror, so the focus on terrorism, fighting terrorism, all the money going in that direction. And then you've got the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan saying attention is being taken away from the common struggle for peace and human dignity. So you've got these 2 leaders pulling in totally different directions. Now, Enrique, give us your view on this, because as the panelists seem to be saying, and the sentiment out here seems to be that maybe the focus is in the wrong place, and the delivery isn't happening. And as Mary mentioned, with the trade scenarios, and everybody was nodding on the panel, you know, the restrictions on the developed world, I mean, it's just seemingly ridiculous.
Well, I think the Secretary General was making a very important statement. I fully agree with him. I think in recent years, the very delicate issues and very dramatic issues of terrorism which are there, were in a certain way putting aside the concern on something which is deeply rooted to the issue of terrorism also, which is a lack of development and the basis of society. And this, I think, that was a very, very sound and valuable comment. But I'd like to refer also, if you don't mind, just to support what Ms. Robinson was saying about this question of what the developed countries can do to support the situation of children and improve the fight against poverty. And this is the price, the subsidies to the agricultural products. She mentioned cotton, I can mention banana, I can mention wool, I can mention, and you see there, when you see that many of these resources go to the pockets of the poor people, not all, and we must watch because sometimes they remain in the middle. The question is whether the elimination of subsidies go to the real roots of society or remains in the middle. That's an issue. But I think this is something to be taken into account, and I think the 8th principle of the Millennium Decade precisely refers to that, that the whole thing in the social sector should be accompanied for more resources to improve the wealth in the pockets of the people. And I think this is a very valid point.
Okay, let's get some more views. There we have a lady here. Oh, we've got lots. That's great. Let's listen to this lady here first.
I am very happy. I'm very happy that we're now starting this discussion on the economic questions. I will work in a world shop that deals in fair trade and accounts for just 5%. And I think that in the industrialized countries, above all, must reflect more deeply on how much our food and our clothes cost. And to what extent am I willing to forego the variety of clothes or the multitude of different food products so that others could get a fair remuneration of their work? Why is cocoa so cheap? Why were the coffee agreements simply thrown out? And why can a country now produce coffee thanks to the help of the World Bank and thus disrupt the entire balance? So I'd be very happy if you could tell me something about your views on these aspects.
Okay, who wants to go for that one? Michael, give us your views.
This is absolutely right. The coffee agreement, which was established during the Cold War to prevent, damage in coffee-producing countries and among the people who do it, was simply abandoned almost immediately after the Cold War ended. And the price of coffee fell from $1.20 to 60 cents, $1.20 to 60 cents. And so there's clearly excess supply. And the reason and the normal economic response to that is to have people exit from the supply side and go do something else. And the problem is that with all these agricultural restrictions, there's nowhere to exit to. And that is a large fraction of the source of the damage that those things cause. And many of us are very worried that there's other sectors that are going to go this route. So we've made progress in sort of trade liberalization in goods. There's very powerful forces that are trying to take the agricultural route in trade and services that's been enabled on the internet. In fact, you can start hearing this now. And so I think a realistic assessment, in coffee, for example, you do have fair trade options in many places, like Starbucks. You can just pay more for the coffee, and they buy the coffee at higher prices. And that works to some extent, but that really does rely on almost everybody who's buying. And so it really doesn't have a huge impact. And the only structural solution to this in the long run is to get rid of the restrictions that prevent people from moving into essentially other products, other agricultural products where they can earn a decent living. Anybody else like to respond to that one? Go on, Mary.
Just in general terms, I mean, many of you may be aware of, the range of thinking that is going on about ethical investments, you know, being much more conscious as consumers of what we're buying, looking at, you know, a whole range of things. And, you know, I think in the trade union movement now, there's a very big reflection on these issues as well. So they are different components that I think will, it's all about accountability.
Yeah. We keep coming back to that, don't we? But I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of the consumer. I know you may feel that just as an individual, you can't really make a difference by spending a bit more on the more expensive coffee in Starbucks or shopping in shops where they are conscious of what's going on in the world, and so therefore you're buying things that are obviously not made by children in, I don't know, North Korea or something. It's just being aware, isn't it, of these situations. Now, the gentleman in the middle here had a question. If we could hear what his thoughts are.
Hi, my name is Olivier. We've heard a lot of interesting things tonight here. Mary Robinson seemed to point out that there's a legal framework existing, and a lot of member states are there to adhere to this idea, and on the other hand, nothing is implemented. Mr. Packer, on the other side, I think is talking about more implementation from bottom-up approach, going into the countries to help communities there to well, to do little things, you know, to build projects. How do you see I mean, you talk about empowerment and also putting pressure on governments to actually do things they ought to do. I think there's a problem in implementing this, in that you have, on the one hand, you have the governments want to do this or should do this, and then you have no control over them to actually, that they act accordingly. So that there could be, I wouldn't say the word sanctions, but you could maybe force them to do certain politics, and then to help their situation improve. But how do you, what can we do as well as Western or rich countries to help them to do so? Or how can we not fall into this pattern where you, on the one hand, you give them pressure and then not helping them themselves to come out of this?
So how do we then enable or put the pressure on governments to make changes?
Well, that and this, and also how do you make governments act accordingly? I mean, there seem to be there should be a sort of a world order, sort of power which push pressure on people, but they don't do it. How do you implement things? Policy?
All right. How do we make things happen? Yeah. Okay. Who wants to respond to that? You're smiling. I'll go for you.
Of course, there are two tools. The tool that comes, as you said, from the grassroots power, this silent revolution that I am convinced it is rising, but it has to rise in a constructive way, not for destruction of the other, but building for these people to build their country. And then, of course, there is pressure at the other level, at governmental level. But we have to talk about the question of democracy, which is everything is linked, because as long as you don't have people who can exercise a minimum of their rights, we're going to have states that are conducted by families, and it's a family plan to put as much money aside as possible. There are many examples all over the place. So I find the West that sends what you call people to check the elections are not always playing their role. I mean, in many African countries that have known elections in the recent years, Chad, for example, Chad came out with the international experts that it was done correctly. Of course, it wasn't done correctly. I mean, it's so obvious if you've lived in the country, and there, perhaps the West is not playing its role. The element of democracy is a must, and to get the power of decision away from just a few in the countries. This year, 2004, is an extraordinary year there are over 50 countries that are going to national elections. They represent almost 50% of the population. Well, that also is a tool that has to be used, and the supervision of the elections in some countries that need it and that accept it has to be done properly.
Enrique, in your experience, where have you seen the pressure on the government be effective in order to bring about, if we try and keep it focused on children's rights here, the discussion?
I think what Ignacio just said is something which I also want to support. Coming from a region that had so many experiences in recent years in terms of dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, the return of democracy was accompanied by a more sensitiveness to these issues. And I think this has to do with the nature of democracy. You see, democracy is not a heroic thing every 4 years voting. It's something every day. It's a more pedestrian type of thing. And this democracy of every day implies, among other things, the role that the media plays. And freedom of the media is a very important stimulating factor, or the role of participatory democracy, in which the system should be improved by having this sort of role of the civic society in the exercise of democracy. So all these things are changing a little bit the sensitivity of the society in a way, more awareness, to the point that nowadays, for instance, when you ask in Latin America to make a poll, to ask to the people, poor people, what are the issues that really they want to prioritize, they do education. Education is something which is really very much valued by the people. And this is, in a way, more consciousness, and this is very much part of the more improved democracy. Even in the private sector, you can see now, we have a program now on ethics and development in Latin America, together with Norway. And we're starting to see, even in the private sector, things that we've never seen before, a real social responsibility. Not only the one that comes from the big multinational, but the people, the small and medium enterprises, the consciousness about the need to be responsive to the social needs is part of a product of democracy as such. So I believe that, in a way, this political dimension should be kept in mind when we're trying to achieve these objectives.
We seem to keep coming back to the issue of accountability, don't we, really, here? Democracy being people voting with their feet and hopefully finding or getting the services that are promised in manifestos. We all know how that works, though, quite often. Ezra, you're smiling. I wanted to ask you about, your region, Southern Africa. Obviously, Zimbabwe is very much in focus right now with the regime there, Mugabe in power. To what extent obviously the pressure on that government right now doesn't seem to be doing much, but in what way can you, perhaps in your organisation, put pressure on or see children's rights improved where you are, with maybe the help of the outside world?
Well, there's several ways, but the way I think I'd like to approach it is to give the example of what it is that for me creates anxiety, and what it is that instead of anxiety would lead to real learning. I've worked in the NGO sector all my working life. And the one thing I learned, because NGOs are largely dependent on donor funding, the one thing that I've always been really paranoid about is if a donor that we have a relationship with mentions that they would like to conduct an evaluation. They say, well, we've been working for the last 2-3 years, we'd like to carry out an evaluation. The first thought that comes to my mind is, what have we done? They're looking for a reason to bail out, to get out of this relationship, right? The mention that was made just now of such mechanisms as election monitors, for instance, while I agree that it has its role, just to use that kind of analogy, I think has the major flaw that it may bring out failures in the system, a lack of accountability and all that sort of stuff. But unless that notion of democracy is rooted in the communities where, you want to see that kind of accountability, you don't get very far. And I think that, the word awareness or consciousness raising, the education that's being carried out that encourages communities to actually take charge and exercise their responsibility and then make that democracy a living democracy, that democratic practice is really what matters. Now, in the case of of Zimbabwe, I think it's a good example. I think what the country has gone through itself has been a massive lesson for those inside the country. But the exercise of certain force, you know, has in certain instances just served to exacerbate the problems of those who are you know, the poorest. I mean, right now, with the sanctions that are imposed against certain figures in the country, the ultimate effects, the ultimate impact of what happens is felt much more by those, you know, the poorest in Zimbabwean society, and not by those who are actually supposed to be the targets of those sanctions. And until the awareness, the consciousness rises to the level where Zimbabweans are able to then make certain demands, which they have been doing. And you know, a lot of force has been meted out on those who make those demands. But I think that this is part of the process of finally engendering that ownership that will then create the state of democracy that causes the change. But that, you know, that takes a lot. But the other area, I think, of solidarity, the other, you know, action that can be taken from those who would like to be seen to be acting in solidarity with the Zimbabweans of this world or other developing countries would be in getting to understand that such requirements as the repayment of debts, you know, which are unsustainable debts, really have to become part of a movement that is supported externally as well as internally. I mean, this is something, if you recall the entire Jubilee 2000 campaign, you know, and the hope and anticipation that came with that, I'm sure you can all imagine the amount of disappointment that visited upon all those who were hoping that finally there will be some way of making a fresh start. That hasn't happened. You know, colleagues here have referred to the failures or the potential failure of the achievement of Millennium Development Goals. I mean, there is so much that one sees and develops a cynicism to the extent where we start saying, well, you know, is this worth even talking about anymore? You know?
Mary, how do we overcome that cynicism? Because, you know, at the end of the day, these declarations are made, commitments to them are made by governments all over the world, by businesses and the other organisations involved. And yet, a lot of people still believe it's rhetoric. How do you overcome that cynicism?
Frankly, we can't afford to be cynical, however difficult it is. I was struck by a report which I participated in the launch of recently about child poverty, global child poverty. It was worked by Peter Townsend and some other colleagues, and was launched in London. And for the first time, they did a major study of 1.2 million children, and they used human rights criteria, not some of the economic indicators that have been used in the past, by which they meant the 5 basics: right to food, safe water, health, education, shelter. And they found such a range, I mean, so many millions of children living in situations of, if it was absolute poverty, deprived of 2 of those, and you know, poverty deprived of at least 1. We have a population of just over 6 billion. It's going to increase to 8 billion, and more than 8 billion, in a way that we've never envisaged before. And most of that additional 2 billion will be right down there at the bottom, and that will include all of those children. So, in fact, far from a cynicism, if you like, I have a sense, certainly among women in leadership positions, because I'm glad we're tackling this at both ends, because that's what's needed. And in fact, next week, I will be meeting with a group of women leaders called together by Marion Wright Edelman, because there's child poverty as never before in the United States, because that system is not working well. And it's because that's really being felt, that there's a kind of leadership responsibility. And if you look at it in a curious way, child rights and child poverty have never been, as much as they should be, a leading issue for women in leadership in the women's movement. And I think we're going to take stock of this, because far from being cynical about it, we feel, as I said, a sense of urgency that I think we're reflecting on this platform. And I agree about the debt issue. And I have heard a number of NGOs in developing countries say, you know, Jubilee 2000, And why have NGOs of the developed world sort of gone through a cycle and said, now we're moving on? Because we can't move on from that issue, you know, and these are all connected. But, you know, we cannot go on with the status quo. And that is, if you like, why in this initiative that I'm heading up, just as one effort to do it, we've put the words ethical and globalization together. We cannot have this economic, corporate globalization dominating, where the values are competitiveness and, you know, market values. We must get back to the Millennium Development Goals, to the human rights commitments, and not have rhetoric, have implementation. And it has to be at grassroots level, it has to be at every level. But the only way you empower people is through tools of empowerment, tools of holding to accountability. And that's the only message. And we have to urgently take the Secretary General's cue from his speech here in Davos and get back on track, as Enrique has said.
All right. Okay, we're having a great discussion here, and I feel we're getting to the heart of the matter. We've got about 15 minutes to go, so let's get some more views. We've got a gentleman there who has his hand up.
We spoke a lot about governments and World Bank and IMF and so on. We don't spoke a lot about companies. And companies are one of the main actors of this problem. So these last days in the other forum, we heard a lot about health problems, and what companies are doing for these health problems. For instance, really pragmatic initiative to cure their people against HIV/AIDS and so on. So what are these multinational companies doing for instance, for the children education? Are they doing anything, or is there, like for the health problems, great pragmatic initiatives or not?
Okay. Michael, yes, please, give us your views on that.
It's a good question. First, a slightly negative response in the following sense. If you actually want to make a very big difference, you have to recognize that the multinationals collectively are not the lion's share of the employment in the developing countries or among poor people around the globe. So you can do some good if you can influence their behavior, but you won't. And if the kind of pressure that Mary's talking about is effective, then we will see increasingly examples like the following. I'm associated with Nike on the board. Nike now has a foundation. It's doubled in size, and the second half, which is new, is going to focus on girls' education. And if every multinational did that, i.e. created a foundation to run beside it, made part of it focused on one of these issues, in this case it happens to be right on target, then yes, I think you would actually do some good, and I'm reasonably optimistic that you'll see more of that in the next 10 years because of the efforts that have been discussed.
Also as well, what is becoming more aware, there's more awareness amongst the investment community, as a lot of investors are choosing to invest ethically, so they're actually choosing to invest in companies like, for example, Nike, that has a part of its business that is focused on improving the world we live in. And so shareholder power as well is becoming stronger, I do believe. But I want to know about, obviously, companies are doing their bit, some are anyway, and it's better, hopefully more will be involved. But are there examples of somewhere where governments, NGOs, companies, other organisations are all working together to actually improve children's rights? Is there a place, or do you know of one?
Yeah, I can come with many negative examples where
I want a positive one.
I have the feeling that the wolf has disguised himself as a sheep. But one very positive one is the eradication. We're almost there for the eradication of polio. This is work that started in 1988. 1988, there were about 1,000 children newly suffering from polio a day. 2003, statistics show that there are 686 children. So almost there for the eradication of polio. There's a large problem in northern Nigeria where they have, where some provinces have decided that they do not want to go further with the vaccination of their children because they're afraid that it brings AIDS, or that there are contraceptives that are being given to their children. That's a lack of communication with the community, and this work has been vertical. It's cost a fortune, $3 billion, but it's almost there, and this is a reduction of a lot of suffering for children, and it has been done as a combination from UN agencies, NGOs, governments, and also the private sector, the business sector that has financed a good share of this.
Mary, have you got examples? Because I know that's pretty much what you're involved in.
Yeah, I would echo that. I'm involved on the Vaccine Fund, which is allied to Gavi, which is, I think, what you're describing, which is a good partnership that's actually working. And it's working in two different ways. It's providing vaccination, reaching children who weren't reached before, and upgrading the vaccinations for children. I could give you figures, and they're quite impressive. But it's also strengthening delivery systems for vaccinating children. And, for example, the country we looked at was Mozambique. And it's a simple thing. It's $20 per extra child vaccinated. You get $10 if you comply with certain criteria, and it does involve, right down to local level, NGOs, governments, and private sector to a certain extent. And then you get another $10 if you satisfy other criteria. And Mozambique used the additional money that it meant for the project there to invest in motorcycles. Now, nobody in Geneva thinking about vaccinating children would think of motorcycles, but in rural areas they were a vital part of getting to otherwise communities where it wouldn't have happened. And that was just one part of a support for an infrastructure. Out of the Johannesburg Conference on Sustainable Development, there is more public-private partnerships going on. I think that some people are very worried that it's kind of giving more credibility to a lot of privatization. So it's not always easy. But I think UNICEF is trying very hard to involve corporations that have a lot of both know-how, management skills, and I have to say many businesses do have committed people who want to be involved. So that is certainly, part of what we need to do. But when I look at those figures for child poverty, when I look at the lack of access to the basics, when I look at the number of children that are dying unnecessarily and to me totally immorally, we're not scratching the surface yet. That's the reality, and that has to be said.
Enrique, when it comes to how you fund or enable funding for Latin America, for example, do you approach big businesses at all, or are you involved in that sort of operation at all? Not much. I mean, we are much more directly working with governments, but we are starting to open new lines of cooperation in certain areas. Still is growing sensitivity, not there yet, it's coming. But in an area where we try to become activists in data and health, we're trying to, incidentally, you mentioned polio. As you mentioned, the Rotary was the one who helped to eliminate polio in Latin America, and it was a very successful campaign, and also other diseases. So in a way, there is a tradition, particularly in this area, of being sensitive and working with that. And I think we should continue doing more. All right. Well, the time is 5 minutes to 7. Michael, go ahead.
You may have heard this before, those of you who've been here all afternoon, but the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is not small, and it is focused on health in the developing countries in a number of ways, including a partnership with Merck in Botswana to try to make a major dent in the medical delivery systems, and then the appropriate administration of antiretroviral drugs for taking care of active AIDS patients. So all these things, when taken singly, are drops in the bucket, but there are a growing number of them.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to wind this up now because we're going to be strict on timing, but I have to say we haven't is such a huge issue. There's so much to talk about, and one of the things we haven't touched on, we've skated over it, is the issue of AIDS, and that impact on children, which is going to be enormous. However, we have talked a lot about ways of improving children's rights, and it would seem we all have to play our part, whether we're a prime minister, a president, a consumer, the CEO of a company, an NGO, a nurse, teacher, whatever, in order to improve children's rights. We all can play our part, but certainly pressure on those that do really make the difference is something we can do as well. I'd like to thank our panelists. Before I wrap up, I just want to give you a quote which I thought was really encouraging. I know it's one that Mary likes very much because I found it researching Mary Robinson, in fact, but I'm pinching it for tonight because it's very apt. And it's the words of Václav Havel when he wrote an essay back in 1978. The essay was called The Power of the Powerless. And this is what he had to say. For the real question is whether the brighter future is really always so distant. What if, on the contrary, it has been here for a long time already, and only our own blindness and weakness has prevented us from seeing it around us and within us, and kept us from developing it? So there's a thought for the day. Thank you very much to you all. Thank you too as well. Thank you too for your participation and being involved, and may we encourage you to play your part. Have a great weekend, and thanks for joining us.